Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are calling from. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar. This event is being hosted by the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, Standing Committee on Anti-Corruption, and I welcome the chair of the WFEO, Jose Vera, for participating with us in this event. So it's being organized by the WFEO in collaboration with the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, which is here represented by Bill Henry. My name is Kamel Ayadi. I'm speaking from Tunisia, and I will be your moderator of this event. I know that it might be still early in the morning for some of you, while it could be rather late in the evening for others. Let me mention especially our guest speaker, Win Yang, who is speaking from Singapore. Welcome, and thank you very much for making the time for this event. A big thank you all for making the time for that. Today, we will be talking about measurement. Why measurement matters? Why do we need to quantify? The response to this question is so obvious. As we cannot manage what we do not measure, we cannot improve what we don't quantify. So measurement is so important for every potential stakeholders in this domain, particularly for policymakers, anti-corruption agency, and so on. However, what we have witnessed over the past years, that on the one hand, countries have deployed anti-corruption strategy and have put resources to implement them, but only a few of them have thought about measuring the impact and the progress to find out what have been achieved and what need to be done. At the same time, we have witnessed, on the other hand, a proliferation of global measurement indices. Some of them focus on corruption, such as the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, while others focus on governance. The question is, what exactly do these instruments measure? To what extent do they serve local needs in terms of assessing progress, and how governments at local level can use them to increase their local performance? These questions are highly topical, particularly when we know that governance is a broad concept and perhaps an elusive concept to grasp. Today, we will learn a great deal about one of these instruments that measure good government in a very effective way, the Chandler Good Government Index. The CGGI is a composite and comprehensive, maybe the most comprehensive index. We will explore some of we will have the opportunity to explore some questions about what is good government, how it is built, and how it could be sustained. Why is anti-corruption important for good government? Why is anti-corruption so important for building strong government capabilities? So let me welcome again our guest speaker, Win Yang. After his presentation, his keynote presentation, we will immediately give the floor to our next speakers. We have Eza, who is representing the Bolaji, the chair of the Independent Corrupt Practice and Other Related Offences Commission in Nigeria. Then we will give the floor to Sarah, senior specialist at the UNDP. And then, last but not least, we will give the floor to Barbara, policy analyst at the OECD. They will give us a brief comment or questions just to kick off the discussion. Welcome the three of you. But before all, let me give the floor to my long-standing friend. We have been working now in anti-corruption issue for almost 2 decades. Bill Henry, the past chairman of the American Society of Civil Engineers, who will say a few welcome words on behalf of the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center. Bill, you have the floor, then you will start immediately after him. Thank you very much.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I'm Bill Henry. As Kamel said, I'm past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers and a member of the GIACC Advisory Council, a role I share with Kamel. Kamel is a past president of WFEO and was the first chair of the WFEO CAC. It shows the importance WFEO places on anti-corruption by having a past president chair the CAC. I had the pleasure of serving on that initial CAC with Kamel. Neill Stansbury, the leader of GIACC, wanted to be here today, but a needed medical procedure got in his way. We owe him and his wife, Catherine, our thanks for all they have done to address corruption in our global engineering construction industry. I'm sure we all wish him a speedy and full recovery so he can resume his important leadership role in addressing corruption in our global engineering construction industry. It's great to be an engineer because the products and the projects we plan, design, construct, operate, and maintain make the world a better place for humanity. But our industry, which does so much good, is also the industry where corruption, which kills people and causes our work to be less effective than it should be, occurs too frequently. We all have to play a key role in addressing this problem. A friend remarked to me shortly after began ASCE's increased emphasis on ethical practice and addressing corruption that one of the things our emphasis had done was to give people the vocabulary they needed to make anti-corruption and ethical practice a part of their everyday conversations at work, in their professional meetings, and in their communities. An important part of the vocabulary is the data on what is working to reduce corruption in countries around the world. For years, as Kamel said, Transparency International has produced its Corruption Perceptions Index, which rated the openness and transparency of contracts in countries. The idea being that the more open and transparent contracting was, the less likely it was that corruption could be present. The Chandler Good Government Index, which we'll hear about today, goes beyond openness and targets 7 pillars of good government that show that investing in strong government capabilities is vital to securing positive outcomes for citizens and businesses, which will reduce corruption. Think about the importance of your government having leadership and foresight, robust laws and policies emphasizing the importance of the rule of law, having financial stability, being an attractive marketplace, having global influence and reputation, and having programs that help people rise. These 7 pillars are evaluated for each country, and the results are a ranking of the good governance in each country. I think I can speak for all of us that this webinar will open our eyes wider and give us the vocabulary and data we need to address corruption in our workplaces and with the people in all our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And now the floor is to you. You have 30 minutes to present to us the CGGI, please.
Thank you very much, Kamel, and thank you, Bill, for your remarks as well. And thank you to the other panelists who have taken time to give us comments and feedback on our work. So my name is Neng. I'm the Executive Director of the Chandler Institute of Governance, which is an institution based in Singapore, but we work with governments around the world. We are not a think tank, we are not academics, and I look forward to learning from those of you who have done a lot of robust and rigorous research on anti-corruption measurement. I come to you as a practitioner, a former practitioner from the Singapore Civil Service, and also many of my colleagues in the Chandler Institute of Governance are former government practitioners. So we are motivated to create the Chandler Good Government Index, and also motivated to have a larger conversation with all of you about how to measure what is good government. Firstly, it's not something that is easily defined. And secondly, how do we measure it? Because it's something that's close to our hearts. It's something we believe is important. And I'll go into a bit more detail of why. Our index focuses on capabilities, as Bill mentioned and Kamel mentioned, but also, of course, looks at some of the outcomes of good government that affect people's lives. So without further ado, I'll just do a very quick presentation, but the objective is to serve as a springboard for a broader discussion on what good government is and whether capabilities matter and how we measure these capabilities. And how, of course, how governments can improve these capabilities that matter. So the first thing I want to talk about is, of course, what is good government? And that's a question that many people who have done a lot of work on this have come up with various answers to this question. So I just want to be very, to approach this question from a position of humility, that the CIG and my team certainly do not think we have a monopoly on wisdom. We don't think we have the only definition of what good government is, but we do think that we want to put forward an idea of how we might think about it, what matters for good governance, and how we can measure it effectively. Because as some of our, Kamel and others said earlier, measuring helps us to manage something of importance to us. Our conviction is that national governance and national prosperity are deeply connected. And this is the mechanism. Governments that do the right thing, that are capable, trusted, and provide good public services and good laws and sound governance create effective opportunities for citizens and businesses to thrive. This then creates an environment of trust when citizens are able to trust their governments. And we saw how important this was during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we had experts like Francis Fukuyama talking about how trust was the deciding factor in how countries responded to COVID-19. We see that trust in government and an environment of trust and good governance leads to better outcomes. It leads to people being more willing to comply and to obey government regulations, which might be controversial, for instance, lockdowns and social distancing measures during the pandemic. It also means that businesses might be more willing to invest and pay taxes. And that in turn leads to savings and investment and incomes and jobs for people in a country. So our conviction is that good government matters, that we want to support governments to be part of the solution in national development and in national prosperity. So we wanted to find a way to think about good governance in a way that we can measure and in a way that we can meaningfully take action on. So the first thing is that we want to approach this topic a little bit differently, rather than looking at the only on outcomes of good governance. So for instance, certain outcomes of good governance you might look at are things like literacy rates, life expectancy, the outcomes and maybe environmental quality. These are outcomes that a good government might be able to steward and might be able to produce. Now, we also wanted to look at capabilities. So for instance, what are the capabilities that a government needs to succeed in terms of its leadership, in terms of its systems and processes, and in terms of what it can do, right? The resources and assets at its disposal. So there are many different capabilities that governments need to do a good job. So we look at, for instance, the capabilities to build infrastructure, to run public amenities and infrastructure like airports and facilities like ports, to create public amenities like parks, to make laws and to participate in international negotiations, to ensure good and inclusive urban development, for instance. So there's a plethora of capabilities that governments need. And we tried to identify some of the key capabilities that matter for governments around the world, regardless of ideology or political system. And this is something that we also wanted to try to contribute to the debate. We wanted to see whether there were capabilities that mattered, regardless of the political system or the ideology of a country. So our hypothesis was that perhaps whether or not a country was perhaps social democratic or democratic, or maybe even a bit more on the authoritarian side, we had a hypothesis that certain capabilities would still be important. For instance, the ability to enforce and to implement programs and policies, the ability to communicate and engage stakeholders, the ability to budget and to plan. So these capabilities might be important for governments across the world. Based on this, we then spoke to practitioners and leaders in government around the world. So just to highlight very clearly that the Chandler Good Government Index does not rely on primary data collection. We don't see that as our role. We see our role in terms of curating a set of good metrics and good indicators that to us represent what good government is. So we held interviews and sessions with government leaders and practitioners around the world where we asked them, well, in your experience working in government, what are the capabilities that matter most to your success and most to your government's performance? We collected this data, we distilled it down, and this forms the conceptual framework for our index. So the feedback from practitioners around the world, whether they be members of the CGGI advisory panel, which you see here, or other government leaders and practitioners who are not shown on this slide, whom we interviewed over a period of about a year across 5 continents. And we were heartened by the fact that a lot of their responses were very similar, although some of them came from higher income countries, some came from lower income countries, but nonetheless, their responses on the kinds of capabilities that helped them most to succeed were fairly aligned. And so this gave us, this encouraged us to try and see if we could measure these capabilities that matter to practitioners. We then validated the findings with a global advisory panel, which you see here, representing a broad range of experts from various organizations and countries around the world. This then gives rise to the conceptual framework of the Chandler Good Government Index. We see, as Bill mentioned earlier, 7 pillars that to us represent good government. These are leadership and foresight, robust laws and policies, strong institutions, financial stewardship, an attractive marketplace, global influence and reputation. Now, these 6 pillars broadly represent important capabilities that we think that governments need to do well. The last pillar is a pillar that focuses on outcomes. And this pillar, you will see helping people rise, focuses on the outcomes that we might associate with good government, that governments have a fair amount of control over by means of the government spending and government provision of public goods and services. So this then gives us an index framework where we tried to source for the best indicators and metrics that would allow us to measure capabilities in each of these 6 pillars. Now, I must be honest and say it wasn't always possible to find an ideal indicator or metric. We have been very transparent in terms of our choices of indicators and metrics, and you can see all these in the index report that we published on the CGGI website. So I'll provide a link to that later. And I please welcome everyone to take a good look at the indicators and metrics that we've used. We are aware that these indicators are not always perfect, but we have tried our best to find the best possible indicators that, number one, are freely available so that they can be replicated and analyzed. Secondly, that they cover a lot of countries because our goal was to produce a global index. And also, thirdly, of course, to be the best that we have found in terms of being able to represent the capabilities of a government in that respective area. Now, what this means is that, please do bear in mind that the metrics and the indicators shown on these 6 pillars, these first 6 pillars, represent, as far as we are able to represent, they represent capabilities rather than results. So for instance, in international diplomacy, we measure factors like the number of international embassies and consulates that a country has around the world. To us, this is a capability that countries have to exercise diplomacy around the world. Having a broad network of embassies and consulates allows a government to gather information, to network with other governments, to make its positions known during international negotiations and to negotiate with its government partners around the world. This is a capability. How this capability is used and whether this capability then translates into good outcomes is a separate issue that we study. But please bear in mind that most of these, to the best of our abilities, aim to represent capabilities of a government. So I'll show you just a snapshot of the top 30 countries in the CGGI. And you can see here that, and of course the green and red boxes show whether countries have risen in rank or fallen in rank from last year's index. Now, you can see, number one, that there are a fair number of high-income countries in the top 20 especially. So one common question we are asked is whether or not a country needs to be wealthy to have a good government. And we think that, to be very honest, we see a correlation. We see a correlation, which I'll talk about more later, but we believe that this is a virtuous cycle, that good government, as I mentioned earlier, is a good foundation for economic development and economic growth. And in turn, economic growth and development provides the government with the resources, such as tax revenue and a broad tax base, in order to deliver on its policies and programs. We're also heartened to see a good number of middle income and lower income countries in the top 50, which suggests to us that the income is not the only factor that determines the quality of a country's governance. So why this matters, I think, for us this evening, and I would like to seek your views on this, is how we see that anti-corruption is closely correlated with good governance. Firstly, we see that good governments are less corrupt. In fact, we see a very high correlation. And of course, we know that correlation is not causation, but we do see very often that when you see countries with strong anti-corruption performance, we also see that they have a strong overall ranking in the CGGI. And why government capabilities matter in the fight against corruption is because there are certain capabilities that are closely correlated with good governance. So the capabilities that we measure in the index, these three capabilities, anti-corruption, the rule of law, and property rights, are the capabilities of government that are most correlated with the overall index score. And we can see, therefore, that anti-corruption capabilities are vital for government to be effective and achieve good outcomes. For instance, firstly, anti-corruption is closely linked with the pillar on helping people rise. And helping people rise, remember, is the pillar on outcomes such as health, social mobility, gender equality, and education, which most people in most countries care about. So the correlation is strong in terms of countries that have corruption under control and countries that also can deliver effective programs to help people rise. And of course, we see that low corruption enables countries to prosper in several ways. In the Corruption Perceptions Index, we see that the top 30 countries are all high-income countries, but in the bottom 40, none are high-income countries. Of course, the connection and the relationships are very complex. We don't mean to suggest a simple one-to-one relationship, but we do see that there's a lot of correlation between the two. I pointed out earlier that good governments tend to have higher income levels. In this chart, we can see that countries, and you can see the color coding represents the World Bank classification of for income of countries ranked in our index. We see that in general, income level is quite closely correlated to good government. We also see some promising outliers, countries that are outperforming in terms of doing better than their GNI per capita might suggest in the index. One thing that has struck us over the past year is that we have, of course, tried to study whether a good governance capabilities can support a country in its pandemic preparedness. We've seen countries around over the past 2 years, of course, deal with the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic around the world. We see that good governance explains the difference in pandemic preparedness between countries better than GDP per capita. So what that means is that a country with good governance is actually more likely to be well prepared for pandemics than a country that is simply rich. Although, of course, the two are, of course, independently correlated. So when we see that anti-corruption is correlated with good governance, we also see that anti-corruption is closely correlated with other important public sector capabilities. So other capabilities that the index measures are closely correlated with anti-corruption. We see, for instance, that when governments are less corrupt, they also tend to have better and more inclusive systems of protecting property rights, both intellectual property and physical property. And of course, this in turn creates conducive environments for innovation and investment with good property rights protection. We see that anti-corruption is also closely linked with robust laws and policies of the country, and that less corrupt governments have a stronger rule of law. Now, this is of course obvious because the two concepts are very closely linked. But we do see that capabilities matter to support anti-corruption. So anti-corruption is of course likewise closely linked with quality of judiciary, and that less corrupt countries tend to have more effective public institutions. Now, this will not come as a surprise to those of us who've been working in anti-corruption for a very long time. But then the next question comes that we try to answer, which is, if we do know that these are closely correlated, that effective public institutions, the rule of law, do indeed support anti-corruption, then how do we work with governments to strengthen public institutions, strengthen rule of law, and strengthen property rights? Because these are closely correlated with anti-corruption. We therefore think that governments, of course, need to invest in developing good capabilities in anti-corruption and other areas in order to do well. And this to us, and I'm speaking partly here as a practitioner, that we do realize that anti-corruption is really a whole of government effort. That in countries that have managed to control corruption effectively, and no country can entirely control corruption, of course. For instance, Singapore ranks fairly highly in international anti-corruption indices, but there is, of course, still corruption in Singapore, and no country is entirely corruption-free. But we see that in countries that have effectively controlled corruption, it's a whole of government effort. That control of corruption is not just limited to the anti-corruption prosecution agency or investigation agency. There's a whole of government effort involving robust laws and regulations, and impartial and effective judiciary. Of course, effective anti-corruption investigation agencies, and good efforts within the government to communicate and educate the public on the importance of anti-corruption efforts. We see the importance of course, of far-sighted leadership with strong political will, a good ethos and values within the civil service, good training for agencies involved in anti-corruption, and systems, processes, and controls within all government agencies, including audit and procurement processes, clearly that will support a broader anti-corruption effort. And so we see that a lot of these are very closely linked with the capabilities that are measured in the CGGI, that for a country to effectively deal with corruption, it requires a broad range of capabilities across a broad range of agencies and ministries and departments. I just want to end off the presentation just by highlighting several features on the index very quickly. That on the index website, please do visit and let us know what you think. You can filter the index results by income, GDP, or population, or by pillar. We can also compare country scores and results. And of course, we can track country scores over time. So that's all I have. And of course, sorry, one more thing is that we can customize the weights of the various indicators in the index in case certain indicators are more important to certain countries at a particular point in time. So that's all I have, and I will be happy to answer questions or to participate in the discussion and to learn from the comments that we will receive today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your outstanding presentation. Let's move to the other presenters. So we will hear from now from Isa. Isa is representing the Anti-Corruption Commission in Nigeria. Please, Isa.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me present Professor Bolaji's statement. With your permission, I will go off screen so that my bandwidth will not interrupt the presentation. Okay, thank you. So, first of all, let me say Nigeria commends the initiative of the organizers of this event, especially the effort of Dr. Kamel Ayadi, Director of World Justice Project. Professor Owasanoye has asked me to tell you that he has fond memories of the World Justice Project and the World Justice Forum, both of which he used to attend as a delegate. Corruption measurement tools such as expert assessment, composite indices, perception-based approaches, and experience-based indicators assist in understanding the patterns, trends, types, and perpetrators of corruption. They also aid an analysis of how different societies understand corruption and design anti-corruption measures. However, each of these tools have flaws, weaknesses, and lack nuance, not the least of which is the sometimes narrow perspectives of international governance measurement tools that tend to persistently reflect the opinion of the same set of stakeholders, but not the general population of countries or environments that are measured. Furthermore, contradictory outcomes at variance with some globally recognized realities confound the ultimate purpose of and ultimate utility of some of the measurement tools. It is mind-boggling, for instance, that countries that are notorious tax havens or whose financial systems encourage and greatly benefit from and house processes of corruption rank better on some of these indexes than victim countries whose wealth are stolen through corruption and IFFs, the negative effects of which is poverty and underdevelopment. Furthermore, contradictory outcomes and findings, stale data, and data pulled from narrow sources suggest a high fallibility of some of the findings, if not indicator of outright bias. From an African perspective, the fundamental questions of utility of Western-oriented measurement tools hover around this political and economic interests of the global West. To what extent, if at all, do Western-oriented indicators take account of cultural and governance peculiarities of African countries? Where is the fairness in using the same indicators for economies and countries with unequal economic indicators and political systems without accounting for how different cultures interpret democracy or representative government? Media-driven narrow agenda and public discussions sometimes divert attention from the real indicators of corruption and the appropriate solutions to them. Ultimately, it slows down the positive reform that we assume indicators were meant to catalyze. The specific experience of the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, ICPC, in the measurement of grant corruption through the Nigerian Corruption Index, NCI 2020, deployment of corruption measurement tools in ministries, departments, and agencies of government, such as the Ethics and Integrity Scorecard, suggests that corruption measurement and evaluation tools can be designed to address the peculiar challenges of governance. Furthermore, in 2017 and 2019, Nigeria, with the support of UNODC, collaborated with our National Bureau of Statistics and other partners to conduct an experiential survey on the prevalence of corruption in the country. The result was that respondents reported marginal reduction in bribery and corruption, based on the experience of over 30,000 respondents. One of the startling findings of the ICPC NCI was that the private sector in Nigeria ranked first in disobedience of court orders and judgments. Nigeria's experience from the two surveys referenced above is a solid basis for supporting a global departure from reliance on perception-driven rankings. Secondly, when a measurement tool relies on multiple sources of findings, it is only fair that it ranks countries on the same parameters in order to be fair to all. It is inequitable to rank one country on 4 sources and another on 10 sources and present them as equally ranked. We hope the Chandler Good Governance Index, CGGI, will establish itself as credible in order for its findings to truly shine the light for countries impacted by corruption to know what steps to take to mitigate the challenge. The CGGI should not lend itself to becoming another tool for international political economic struggle and a one-size-fits-all approach that is unlikely to achieve the desired result. Measurement tools must adapt themselves to accommodate strategic innovation, new initiatives, and other indices that promote good governance that are often ignored by current measurement tools, such as perception indicators, expert assessment, composite indices, and even some experience-based tools. We must, I repeat, avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to fighting a dynamic phenomenon like corruption. We trust that the CGGI will present policymakers honest, nuanced, and broad-minded appraisal of performance to bring about the change that we all desire. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
That is a statement of Owasanoye.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Sarah, you have the floor now, please. Please, Sarah. Yeah. Sarah, you are muted, Sarah. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'm very pleased to speak to a forum that includes engineers because my mother is an engineer. I don't think she's listening, but I would like to preface my comments about the Chandler Good Government Index by telling you my first experience where engineering and anti-corruption came together for me. Because to me now it's quite logical, but it didn't used to be. I was asked to write a book chapter on post-war reconstruction by George Offrey for an edited volume on contemporary issues in construction in developing countries. And at the time he was actually in Singapore. He was a professor at the National University of Singapore. And I accepted because he's very distinguished and I had great respect. I'd heard him speak at Transparency International conferences. And I said, sure, I'll write a chapter for you, George. And then I realized when he said he wanted me to write about post-war reconstruction, that he meant literally reconstruction, as in building roads and bridges and infrastructure. And that threw me for a loop because I'm a political economist. And I had mistakenly assumed that the chapter would be about rebuilding political systems. So George said very kindly, he's the best editor I've ever had, actually. He's a great person as an editor. He finds a diplomatic way to improve everything. And I went to, he said I could back out. You know, Sarah, you don't have to write this chapter if you didn't understand that it would be about construction or reconstruction, literally. But I went ahead and I framed it in governance terms, but then I analyzed data on construction, on, for example, rebuilding roads and the waste and corruption in Afghanistan, in Timor, in other post-conflict societies. And my mother was thrilled because as an engineer, she finally said, I can understand what you're writing about. It related to her and her work. And since then, I have thought about that because sometimes we speak only in our own community of anti-corruption specialist talking about governance, but it's really about many different dimensions: political, economic, construction, and society. So I'm really pleased to have an audience that is not all political scientists here. And I hope to be stimulated by this engagement, because I really enjoyed reading the publication and seeing the results of your findings this year. I was asked to speak about two questions briefly. So why does measurement matter? And also, how could organizations like UNDP, where I'm working, or other international organizations use the results, the findings of the index to do our work and to improve performance in the countries we're working in? So I think that much of this has been said. It may be obvious, but it's worth saying that political indicators are now widely used to evaluate needs, to highlight problems, and to monitor the effectiveness of policy interventions. So they're necessary. And in terms of, I'm actually on an anti-corruption team, and we focus on specifically anti-corruption, not just governance more broadly. So first, I would say for control of corruption, among other capacities, if we control corruption, it improves the income of the poor and it decreases poverty. So this is really important to be able to benchmark where we are so that we can improve. We want to monitor it as well. And when we increase the control of corruption, it improves, as I said, the income. We also have other things like we need to think about regulation. There are many other factors that would control and improve. And I don't mean to say anti-corruption is the only factor, but it's highlighted in the index. And I think this is really important because corruption negatively impacts economic growth, and it impedes drivers of potential growth, such as investment, private sector investment, public sector investment, human capital accumulation, and there are, as I said, many other factors. I would like to make a second point about control of corruption, which is that when there's a minimum level reached, because I think we're endlessly trying to control corruption, and I don't think it's something that we're going to achieve where there's no corruption. But when we have a minimum level, sort of a threshold, then pro-poor growth tends to accelerate. So if we get beyond the tipping point, then we see an improvement. And if the Chandler Good Government Index is indicating for a particular country that we're below the tipping point, then this really points to a need to improve in this area. And it's not just an even increase, it's a jump once you get over that tipping point. So that's actually a really encouraging factor. Otherwise, it seems like a steep uphill climb that never ends. But there is a tipping point, and that's something that this index can highlight. No one indicator for governance or one best measure exists for all purposes. And one question here is, there are other measures of governance or government, and there are other measurements of control of corruption. But as organizations like UNDP, we look at a variety of expert assessments and also public opinion and other consultations with the public about their experiences to see if the findings across the different measures remain robust and consistent. So if we have reliable results and the generalizations are consistent across different measures, it gives us greater confidence. So it's important that we have more than one way to measure, and we'll see that there are some similarities across, and that's actually a plus. It doesn't mean that we're duplicating efforts. It means it strengthens our confidence in the results. We also need to think about national and local level measures that add nuances, and that they're also useful for diagnosing and monitoring and strengthening the quality of governance across states and within states. And so that's complementary to the Chandler Good Government Index. I wanted to point out something that there were two things. One is there were a few surprises in the results. And then secondly, I thought the dimension of leadership and foresight was particularly innovative. And not just because it mentions anti-corruption, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in, but also because of innovation, adaptability, Because you see with COVID, for example, that many countries that might have had similar, what we thought were similar capacities leading up to 2020, maybe things stalled or even went back to previous years' levels of performance. And while other countries may have actually shot up after recovering from the initial impact of COVID. And so I think that some of these other the other aspects of leadership and foresight might explain part of why we see some of that variation, because they might have the long-term vision, the adaptability, they're more strategic in the prioritization, and also innovative in taking stock of the current situation and saying, let's do things differently. I think you may, like me, have thought that COVID could have been an opportunity where we would take stock of what wasn't working and maybe try to do things differently. And I think in 2020, we all said, let's take this as an opportunity. And then we look back now and we see some countries really did take it as an opportunity to change things, and some are kind of repeating what they were doing before. And so I think this dimension is really interesting. I especially would encourage the ethical leadership component, which is, I think, not part of the 2022 results, but in the future, ethical leadership, I think, would be really also very valuable to measure, because I think that ethical leadership, including putting the public interest ahead of one's own personal interest or private interest, would be critical in determining the performance of a government. Because if you're not public oriented, and if a leader is thinking about their own interest, then obviously that kind of unethical leadership will be to the detriment of performance. The other thing that I mentioned were there were a few surprises, and this leads into how international agencies like UNDP can best use the data. And I think that we could, for one, look at where do we see at the country level a surprise. I think with other measures like the CPI, countries immediately read the results and they look at their own country and they want to see, how did I do? And then they're not happy if they didn't score well, which is a good thing. It can motivate them to improve. But what if they're surprised, even in a positive way? Maybe they did better than some other indicators would suggest. And then we can dig down and look at why. So I think that agencies like UNDP that are working on the country level could look with countries and governments and stakeholders to examine, why did they perform better than they might have expected, or why did they perform worse? And really localize with national and local level additional data collection and analysis. So for example, I was looking at Philippines and Vietnam, where they are on the charts. And I was surprised because intuitively or qualitatively, I would think that they are not the same, but on paper or sort of in their performance and the dots on the graph, they're quite similar. And then Rwanda is very close to Vietnam and the Philippines. So that's kind of a question. Why is that? Can we drill down and look a little more closely? So if I were in Rwanda, I would want to know, how did we do well? And in Vietnam, I might say, are we really similar to the Philippines? Because I think that they had very different reactions and responses to COVID, for example. And I'm mentioning COVID because we had, for example, the graph of better governance is correlated with lower numbers of excess deaths. Better governance is correlated with greater capacity for COVID testing. Also, we had, not related to COVID, better governance is correlated with greater social mobility. And for all of those, it's interesting to look at the country level and say, for example, with the excess deaths, who is actually dying? Not just the number of deaths, but are women or ethnic minorities or other vulnerable people more likely to die? And the same thing with testing. Are some people having more difficulty accessing testing? With social mobility, who is mobile? Not just is there mobility, but who is moving and how? So those are ways that I think that the work that organizations in countries are doing is complementary to the more global picture. It kind of points to questions, and then we can take that up at the local level. It's identifying trends and identifying areas that need to be improved. It does give specific steps for how to improve performance. But I think that it's, and this is because I'm a political economist, I think that it's also a political economy question of what is politically feasible, how does change happen, what would change actually look like in a country. We tend to jump from identifying the gaps and the needs to the solutions, and we need to work out a vision at the country level for what the change would look like. So I think, just to conclude, that the Chandler Good Government Index, together with a localized analysis, can generate new ideas for reform and innovation to achieve SDGs and national government goals and priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for your insights. I very much appreciate your point about putting emphasis in local measurement that could be complementary to global measurement. This is something that we are pleading for. Thank you very much. And let's have Barbara. Yeah, you are muted, Barbara. You have the floor, Barbara, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Barbara Baredes, and I am a policy analyst at the OECD Public Governance Directorate, and I specialize in governance indicators. So my comment will come more from that area than the anti-corruption. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation and for the very interesting presentation of the Chandler Index, which of course I read, but I think it's always interesting to have it presented to us. It makes it come alive. So I would first like to start talking about the fact that good governance is a complex concept, which is of course something that was said before, but I think this is very important because there are very different definitions of what good governance is or what an effective government is. And we should consider, what should we consider as constituting good governance? Is it the results that the government achieves? Is it what the government does, how it does it, what values and principles it follows? So these are very complex questions. And each attempt at measuring good governance provides a unique and useful point of view from which to analyze the performance of governments. And all of those are needed to think better about what the governments do and their impact on citizens and businesses. For these reasons, the efforts such as the Chandler Good Government Index are really appreciated, and they add on to other efforts such as the Inclusive State Index that we contributed to from the Korean Institute of the Public Administration, or other international efforts such as the Sustainable Development Goal 16, which are key to informed decision-making and providing the guidance to decision makers. In addition, the particular novel approach of focusing on government capabilities of this particular index and looking also at outcomes together, focusing on 7 pillars, provides a novel point of view, including these aspects such as long-term vision, which I think Sarah and I would probably like the same way. And then I think since the topic of this webinar is discussing how to identify a reliable measurement instrument, I would like to highlight the fact that a challenge for measuring governance is that the government and the public administration, as well as their actions, cannot be observed directly, as we can do, for example, with natural phenomenon or with things that are in the physical world very clearly in front of us. And we cannot interview them as we do with individuals. So we need to part from a definition of what good governance is, then construct a framework and then select indicators to represent these dimensions. So in addition to this operationalization that we have to do to jump from one complex concept to something that we can measure, then we also have to rely on indirect measures, mostly from citizens' perceptions and experiences with specific institutions or from experts, whether from the government or independent, who through summarizing vast amounts of information or performing an assessment can provide an account of how well the government is functioning. Hence, the quality of our measurement depends on how good the experts are or how good we selected these indirect measures. This we cannot assess directly. Instead, we need to compare our measurement tools against other indicators, whether on the quality of governance, so compare, for example, this index to other indexes, or on government results. And here we can see that on this particular challenge, the Chandler Good Government Index is showing very good results with strong correlations with social mobility, social progress, pandemic preparedness, among others. And for this, I really want to commend this effort because it really shows good results. And now I would like to also discuss a bit what we do at the OECD Public Governance Directorate that could also help in thinking ahead for this particular index, but also for any issues related measurement of good governance. And we have in particular the Government at a Glance series that is a flagship publication of the OECD since 2009. This publication has regional editions in Latin America and the Caribbean, Southeast Asia and Western Balkans, and it measures government activities and results. It uses indicators on government inputs such as government revenues, processes related to government management practices and procedures, and these are particularly in line with the OECD recommendations and are reported by public officials, and outputs and outcomes that are related to the delivery of services, satisfaction, and trust in public institutions. And our contribution to the measurement of public governance is to connect what government does and how it does it to the outcomes for the population, especially in trust in public institutions, which is also key to assess the legitimacy of the government. And I would like to mention as an example of the areas that we include, the OECD Public Integrity Indicators, which measure the implementation of the OECD recommendation on the same topic and measure aspects related to having a system in place to reduce opportunities for corrupt behaviors, changing the culture to make corruption unacceptable, and making people accountable for their actions. And here, this is where we also try to change the focus from measuring corruption to measuring integrity, because I think something that was said here is that, of course, we can never get rid of corruption fully, and instead we really need to promote ethical behavior. So integrity is a way to also put this in a positive light. And also, as part of our effort to improve our publication, we have been working on improving our measurement of government outcomes, particularly regarding trust in public institutions. And for this reason, we have launched the OECD Trust Survey that covers 22 countries and measures the drivers of citizens' trust in public institutions in terms of competence and values. And here it's very similar, the part of competence, to the capabilities of the Chandler Index. The results of this survey will be available in June and will provide an indication of how citizens assess their governments, because of course we can measure how good the government performs, but it's also important to know how citizens perceive their governments, because this really affects their legitimacy and their possibility to govern well. And I think this is also part of what is included in this index. And finally, I would like to highlight the OECD Reinforcing Democracy initiative that focuses on recent challenges that governments are facing, and that also will be probably key capabilities for the future, including combating mis and disinformation, which we have seen creating chaos around the world, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in other situations such as elections in other countries. Enhancing the representation and participation of citizens, because we also see that there is a sort of disenchantment with democracy from citizens that sometimes do not feel that the governments are responsive to their requests, and addressing global challenges such as climate change. And also within the representation aspect, and I think this is a very key issue to think about when we're measuring good government, is the possibility also to measure how representative the government is of the population, because for the policies that governments make might also be influenced by who is in the government or who is in these positions that make decisions. So for us, it's very important to ensure that there is good representation of the different groups of the population in the government, and that also they get to express their views, regardless of the way of government, but really to have spaces where citizens can really express how they feel, because this is also really affecting the legitimacy of public institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for your insight. Thank you very much. We still have 23 minutes for the discussion. So let's open the floor and to have the audience, if you have any question to the main presenters or to any of the rest of the speakers.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one kind of dire comment. We have heard wonderful discussions of the economic damage of corruption and how important good government processes are. But at the root of corruption is the basic fact that corruption kills people. And that gets in the way of having people rise, and that gets in the way of good government processes, and that is not measured by economic measures. So as we talk about corruption, we can talk about all the processes we need, but let's always keep in mind that corruption is a factor that kills people in every country in the world.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. there is one question for we in developing the CGGI government leaders, governance and index experts, resources, academicians, and CGGI advisory panel are relied upon. Is there any specific reason for the omission of persons being, for omission of persons being governed who are the majority? Thank you. Can you understand this question, Wei?
No, thanks so much, Kamel. Yeah, I can understand it. I think it's asking why we didn't maybe consult citizens who are the majority on when constructing the index. I think that's a great question. I think that I just want to say first and foremost that a lot of us at CIG are former practitioners in government. We understand deeply the role of government and the fundamental purpose of government being to serve citizens. And I think that's deeply ingrained in the way we do things. I think when we look at how we incorporate the interests of citizens or the priorities of citizens into index design in a technical, on a technical and complex issue like governance. So what we usually say is that citizens may not be experts on political science or economics, but they are experts in their own lives, and they're experts in their experiences and what they value. So I think that comes up very strongly in the helping people rise pillar of the index, where we want to ensure that outcomes that matter to people, like health, like education, non-discrimination, gender equality, public services and satisfaction in public services. And you can see the outcomes that are in the helping people rise pillar. Those are very much intended to ensure that we don't just consult experts on whether or not capabilities are in place, but we want to be sure that these capabilities are translating into good outcomes that citizens care about. So I think rather than perhaps ask citizens about how they might measure certain complex institutions of government, which might not be optimal, we instead want to find out whether the capabilities that governments have are being translated into outcomes that people care about.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a few other comments, if you may. One of the, I have, after the 28th of April, when the index was launched, I went through the report and I read some of details of this report. And before sending, and I made an exercise to understand how countries in my region are ranked. And my idea, the idea behind that is to try to see, because we can understand from our feeling what is going good and what is going bad in our region. So sometimes we don't need the ranking or the results and the findings of any other to understand what is going on in a country that we know. So before sending articles and the report to local media, I tried to see how Arab countries, they are ranked in this. And particularly, I went to the 7 pillars. And I advise you, if you wanted to read this report, not to just focus on the overall index, but go to the pillars, because the pillars also, they offer ranking in the different pillars. And what I find that all the rankings, all the scores of the countries that at least I know, they're very, very much relevant to the situation of these countries. I see particularly the pillar about attractive place or financial stewardship. This is something that I did, and for this reason, I find that this indicator is relevant and can translate the reality, because the issue that we always have about measurement is whether they translate the reality or not. And I did some work last year to understand to what extent corruption measurement correlate to each other. And I gathered 14 indicators and sub-indicators. And I found out 14 indicators and sub-indicators from CPI, World Governance Indicator, the World Justice Project, which has 4 sub-indicators about corruption, the variety of democracy, and so on. And I found out that they didn't correlate very, very well. So this is something that I can say. The second thing is what I appreciate the most in this indicator is that it focuses mostly on capabilities. 6 pillars are dedicated to addressing capabilities, and the 7.1, helping people rise, is focusing on outcome and the result. And this, I think, what maybe distinguishes this indicator from other, because many indicators, they focus on the outcome. Let's give the example of the indicator that we all know, which is the Corruption Perception Index, which focus on corruption. And for this reason, there is this kind of measurement. They are automatically rejected by countries when they don't rank well and when their results are bad. So these, the indicator which focus on outcome, they are mostly used by the media just to blame their country, to just by media, by social and political activists. So from this, I wanted to just give an advice for people and for country which wanted to go through this issue of measurement. Look of measurement that can evaluate, that can give an assessment about your capability, because you can see in these indicators the shortcoming, you can see the failures, you can then address them. Because what's the point in measuring corruption? As a government, it doesn't help a government to measure, to tell that this government is corrupt or not. Whereas when you measure the capability of a country to address corruption, and you tell them that this is going good and this you have to address this component of capability, then you can help them maybe understand their preventive system and their capability in addressing corruption. So now the trend is to measure and to provide measurement tools that may help government to use these indicators to understand, to find out what is working good in their system and what need to be addressed and need to be improved. This is just a comment about your indicator. The floor is again open if you wanted to have a question or to have a comment for this. Bill, you asked for the floor. Bill. Yes, Bill.
Yes, I would just like to share some things that I learned in looking at the Corruption Perceptions Index results for decades. I noticed that the Scandinavian countries were always at the top of the list. And in talking with representatives from those countries, in trying to find out their thoughts on why they did so well, one of the themes that kept recurring was that the distribution of income within the country was more uniform than it is in many countries. The difference between the highest paid people and the lowest paid people was not as great as we've seen it in the United States or in other countries around the world. I would ask that maybe this kind of concept of income distribution be added to the ideas or the facts that are measured in coming up with your index in the future.
Just to say, Bill, thank you very much for your comment. And I fully agree with you that in the ability of a government to achieve inclusive growth and reduce inequality, of course, we can never totally eliminate inequality, but to eliminate extreme inequality, I think that's one very important capability of a government, it's a very important outcome as well. And indeed, the index currently does measure a concept of income inequality in terms of Gini coefficient. So it does look at the effects of income inequality, because I agree with you that's highly important.
Barbara, you have the floor, Barbara.
Yes, sorry, I think I wanted to add on what Bill said, and just thinking a bit more about the fact that indeed also sometimes we measure perceptions, but the perceptions are not a direct link with or exact direct link to what the government is really doing or what is happening in the government. And I think the point is also to understand sometimes what is driving these perceptions, because in some cases, when the results are not there, also for some reason, that could be what the government is doing, could be also a pandemic, could be also an international crisis, where right now, in a very, very big crisis that is sparked by the invasion of Ukraine. And so if we think about this particular topic, then we realize that also there are some aspects that can make citizens feel in a certain way towards the government that is not necessarily because of what their government did. And this is something that we always have to account for. And this is why when I was commenting the index, I was saying that I also think it's also good to also look at different indicators to really see how good one indicator is in order to say whether this is the indicator that is really the one that we should look at. And my answer is we normally have to look at several indicators to understand what is happening and what must change. So when we only focus on citizens' perceptions, we might have a biased view of what the government is really doing. That was my only comment. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Sarah?
Thank you. I just wanted to also add on to what Barbara's saying. I agree, because we need to look at multiple sources and multiple indicators. And I think that even though it's popular to question the CPI, and I agree fully with you, I've had governments call me up the morning that the CPI comes out and say, why did we score so badly, even though, you know, we've been working so hard. But there is overall a correlation between actual corruption levels, and I mean, it's not completely dissociated with the performance on the CPI. And I think that there's a role for the media to once a year be able to call governments out on it. And I think they're just different purposes. So you need to have different indices and different reports. And I think that while the Chandler Good Government report is probably more constructive, and it certainly has a really valuable purpose for working towards building performance and improving capacities. I don't think we can discount either the value of someone shouting and making, you know, a loud noise about corruption, because I think that that also boosts the motivation to improve performance on the Chandler Good Government Index. So I think they actually work together. And I think as experts or citizens, we have to think, where do we fit? And you know, do we want to be the ones making loud noise? Do we want to be the ones doing data-driven policy making? You know, we all have different ways that we contribute to the fight against corruption. And I think they come together, actually. I wouldn't want to say that perceptions don't matter, or that the only thing that matters is hard data based on, you know, experience. I mean, I think we need to have a combination. And actually, what I think is interesting about the Chandler Good Government Index is, as Uwe mentioned, that it actually includes some aspect of citizens' views and experiences. It's not completely expert-based. And actually, the CPI is expert-based, so it's perceptions of experts. So that's another interesting nuance too. Thank you.
Any other comment, please? Any other comments?
Well, actually, on the risk of monopolizing, I can actually build on that again and say that indeed, I think what is important is really to measure the relationship between the different indicators of perception and what is really happening, to have a view, because also when there is a disconnect, and I think I agree with her, there is a problem. Even if the government has been working well on reducing corruption or improving any aspect, if citizens or experts are working with the government do not see it, then there is obviously a problem that has to be addressed. And I think this is very also difficult, and this is something coming from the work that we do at the OECD. It's also something very difficult to really, for example, for us, we really measure a lot of how governments are following the OECD recommendations on different topics, including governance of infrastructure or integrity. And we have really questions about, do you have legal instruments on this or that, or do you have coordination mechanisms to put this into place? We have different, do you have a strategy? How how much have you implemented of the strategy, etc. But then to really understand how this impacts citizens, it is also a very long way, and it's a very challenging effort to do so. Of course, in between all of this, there is a disconnect, and it's also important to see how citizens perceive it on their side and what citizens receive as well from their government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? We still have 5 minutes, and then we need to save 3 or 4 minutes to Papias to say the concluding remarks. So if there is no other comments, do you have any comments or about what has been said so far?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all the panelists as well as the participants for your thoughts on this. I just wanted to build on your points and to just say that we're very aligned in many ways. I think the first observation I had was that I agree fully with you that because government is complex, we certainly need to consider different types of data and different types of metrics in helping us to measure the capabilities and the performance of government. So likewise, I see the limitations of perception-based metrics, but I don't think we can discount them. I do think that in some cases when governments are taking many efforts, but perceptions are not changing, it might be due to perhaps lack of public education, or maybe perhaps a lack of communication by the government to engage citizens and stakeholders in what they're doing, or it could be because of other things. Like, I fully agree that sometimes, when a government maybe starts to address corruption a bit more, then you have more corruption cases coming out in the mass media, and people actually perceive the country as being more corrupt when it's actually not. So, there are limitations of perception indices. The same way there are limitations of objective metrics, there are limitations of expert assessment, and there are limitations of experience-based metrics. So they're all important in different ways. They all guide us to a facet of the issue. And I think, like what some pointed out as well, we want to see whether these different types of measures are correlated, or whether we can understand the difference, whether they're pointing us to the same thing. The second observation is that I fully agree that we should not be ideological in measuring governance. We should not be driven by certain principles of whether certain ideologies might work the best. So that's at least the approach that we have taken in the measurement of governance. So we have consciously left out things like perhaps the quality of democracy. It's not that we think democracy is not important. We do think it's important. It's not one of the things that we want to measure in this index. Instead, we measure things like accountability and regulatory transparency, which we feel that countries across the political spectrum can agree on. That it's perhaps important to be accountable to citizens, but how that accountability is achieved might differ from system to system. The third thing is I fully agree with both Barbara and Sarah and others about the need to complement global indices with local measurement tools and efforts. I think that certainly we do not think the CGGI is a substitute for robust efforts to measure and monitor governance quality or corruption on the ground. I think that's extremely important that we continue to do that. And so, when Sarah mentioned as well that we want to work with countries to understand differences and rankings and whether there's surprises, that's exactly what we do as well when we work with countries around the world. We go to countries and we say, but do you agree with the rankings, or can you teach us how these rankings might differ from your experience as practitioners? I think that's given us very valuable information so far. So we'll continue to do that, and rest assured that we are not pushing any agenda. We would like to contribute a robust and useful tool to the debate and to practitioners who are working on the issue. So we'll continue to get better, and thank you for your feedback on this.
Thank you. Just Bill, just 1 minute, and we will give the floor to Papias for the concluding remarks. Please, Bill.
Just a short comment, and this is to all the delegates who are attending this webinar. As I said at the beginning, we now have the vocabulary, and we need to address corruption in our workplaces, in our professional organizations, and with all the people in our communities. That's the challenge you have after attending this webinar, is to go put it to use in your communities. I see Jaime Santa Maria is on the webinar. He is a classic example of what one individual can do to spread the word about anti-corruption's importance in his community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Papias, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the presenters and panelists. On behalf of the World Federation of Engineering Organization, I would like to thank everybody who participated. more especially the panelists. It has been very informative and very educative, and we promise that the recordings that have been made are going to be circulated through different institutions of engineering in different countries. I fully support the ideas presented by all the panelists. We need to all come together to fight corruption, and by doing so, we have to be loud and tell the governments, tell all the stakeholders, and be in workplace, be everywhere. Corruption is a scourge, corruption is dangerous and deadly. And thank you very much. And I thank the host as well, Ivan, Mr. Kamel, and all the participants on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Papias. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you very much for your insight. We enjoyed very much your presentations. Thank you to our audience. You can find after the recording, you can watch again this webinar. It was an exciting webinar, and thank you very much once again, and have a nice time for those who are going to bed and have a nice day for those who are starting their day. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.